in like an hour and a half in March of 2020, right? We really got it down.
Well, hello and welcome back. Happy New Year to all you fine people. Thank you very much for coming to this is the first, I believe, real or formal event at the workshop since we rang in 2025. So we have the research series this fine day, and I think we'll be back with the colloquiums next week. I can't tell you who we got lined up, but I know we got a pretty packed spring semester. So hopefully those of you joining online are nice and toasty in your homes. I mean, it's what, a balmy 7 degrees right now. And we've got Nishant here talking to us about challenges and opportunities for disaster governance in India, and geography, doctoral student, studies governance and political economy, and very much appreciate you coming here today. So I'll turn it over to you, and then when you wrap things up, I can use the remote to make sure we can engage the online audience. Sure. Take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Nishant Buragohain. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Geography. And this research is basically, I have prior experience of working in the field of disaster management for about 10 years, mostly in India and Nepal. And this research are like some of the initial findings. Some are field works and some literature. So Assam is located in the northeastern part of India. It's on the northern side, it's the country of Bhutan, and then the hilly state of Arunachal Pradesh, and the southern side, there are 3 other hill states, Nagaland, Manipur, Nagaland, and Meghalaya, which used to be part of Assam prior to, like, post-independence. It got divided into states. The main, there are several rivers, and the main river, which is Brahmaputra, flows right across the state, and it originates in Tibet, flows across Tibet, takes a U-turn and enters India in the state of Arunachal Pradesh, then enters Assam, and goes through Bangladesh, and then joins Bay of Bengal.
Good.
Yes.
You've been in the news, this has been in the news recently because of a big dam that's gonna be built
Yes.
by China.
Yes.
Are you gonna talk about that?
Not really.
Where's that dam gonna be, just for curiosity's sake?
Somewhere here.
Okay,
And it is supposed to be 3 times bigger than the current biggest dam in the world, which is also in China. Brief overview of Assam at the moment. The estimated population, we haven't had the census since 2011. Hopefully it'll happen this year. But the population is about 35 million. Of current geographical area of Assam is about 78,000 square kilometers. Economy is quite decent, 68 billion, which is equivalent to Costa Rica's economy. Human development index is average, is about 0.5. Per capita income is roughly about $1,300 annually. So for my research, I was looking at like why government has been involved in flood mitigation for a long time, and yet every year the story repeats. The flood happens and a lot of people get displaced, a lot of properties get damaged, agricultural land, houses, and other infrastructure. So why all these flood mitigation efforts have not been effective so far is something I was interested in looking at. At the same time, I came across this set of questions by Gilbert White in one of his articles. He also talks about like why all these mitigation efforts tend to don't work, and these are some of the basic questions we need to ask ourselves. Is like, is there knowledge? Is there insufficient knowledge? Is the knowledge not being applied properly? Is there a time lag between what is being done and the result to be seen? And is there overwhelming amount of vulnerability, which is not allowing the interventions to be effective. So my argument is like based on my understanding and what I've seen on the field during my field work and talking to respondents is like there's a whole set of historical processes of economic development, which makes disaster governance very difficult at the moment. The usual there is some level of political will, but it's not enough for things to be effective. And then there are a set of ecological processes like the 1950s earthquake and then other issues, ecological processes, which also poses challenges for disaster mitigation. For my research, I in the state of Assam, I'm visited the district of Dibrugarh and Jorhat. And Guwahati is like the main largest city in the state and has all the government head offices, a lot of libraries. So I visited there. I interviewed about 42 individuals representing like local communities, like flood affected. From the flood affected communities, some of the academicians, current academicians, retired academicians, people from private sector like the tea estates, and government officials, and some civil society, NGO workers as well. Literature review is based on the field of political ecology, environmental history. Also looked at like fluvial geomorphology articles to understand the scholars who have studied the problem of flooding and erosion, especially in Assam. And then other documents related to political geography. And also I did archival research, mostly in Assam, in district library in Assam, as well as a university library. There's a state archive, government state archive, where declassified documents are being kept. And I found some useful maps in our university library as well in Bloomington. So these are this is the location of the two districts which I visited. And these are like the flood hazard zone maps developed by the government. And these are the green boxes highlight the areas which I visited during my fieldwork. And that's the Brahmaputra River flowing on the northern side of the district. So in terms of disaster risk, like roughly about 40%, 39% of the total area of the state is flood prone. Soil erosion has emerged as a major issue, especially since 1950. Economic losses is annually roughly about $309 million. And human fatality is roughly about 74 per year. And these are some of the statistics like economic losses in terms of US dollar million. So you can see like every year, especially 2016 was devastating, but in general, there's always been above like roughly about 100 million every year. In terms of sectors, like embankments tend to get damaged, like they tend to report more damages every year. You can see from the orange graph, and followed by road infrastructure, which is also one of the highest apart from houses and agricultural land. It's a bit messy, but there are like, in terms of disaster governance in India, there are 3 levels at the federal, state, and district, and as well as sub-district. So mostly it's a lot of the disaster funding is basically managed by the National Disaster Management Authority, which is attached to the Ministry of Home Affairs, even though it's an autonomous body, but it reports to that ministry. At a similar level, the state level, in case of Assam, the State Disaster Management Authority is attached with the Revenue Department, whereas in some other states, sometimes they are independent department, or sometimes they are attached with Revenue or Home Department. At the district level, there's a district disaster management authority, which reports to district administrator and district commissioner. And then they have level builds at the sub-district level. They have some officers at the revenue circle, which revenue again of circle office reports to the revenue department. So important things to note here is like land use comes under the revenue department, whereas embankments, management of embankment comes under the water resources department. Dams, even though like have the federal top item subjects and state subjects, water management is largely at the state level, but when it comes to power generation like dams and all are mostly under the Ministry of Jal Shakti, which is water resources. And all these development, apart from these development activities, tend to follow the same law, and then they are implemented at the grassroots level, at the district, sub-district level through these different actors. So when I was looking at all these different events throughout in the late medieval period, colonial period, and the contemporary period, I found there are some major events which have shaped the flood governance, disaster governance in the case of Assam. So in the 13th century, when the Ahoms they arrived somewhere in the region of Shan in Burma and Yunnan, southern Yunnan in China, and established their kingdom. They initiated settled agriculture in the state. So which prior to that, it was mostly shifting cultivation practiced by the indigenous communities. And then the kingdom sustained for about 600 years. Towards the end, like there were civil wars, which started towards the end of like 18th century, and then followed by Burmese invasions in early 19th century, which has severe implication in terms of farm population. A lot of people died. The population was at the lowest at that point. And then in 1826, the British annexed the state to its empire, like the rest of India, which they were already ruling at that time. And then once British arrived, they found tea plant in growing indigenously, natively. And then to promote tea plantations, they came up with like wasteland grants rules in 1838, which allowed, and subsequent policies which allowed European investors to take up a lot of land, and that which displaced indigenous communities from their native areas, as well as led to lot of deforestation at that point. And eventually the British realized the value of some of the timber which was available in the forest. So they came up with the Forest Act in 1878 and subsequent policies to again kind of limit community access to forests because they were harvesting like timber or wood for firewood and other purposes. So so that way they kind of alienated people, natives from the forest, accessing the forest. In 1947, India became independent. Since then, 1950s earthquake, which was about 8.7 Richter scale, was a massive, which led to severe erosion in many parts of the state, and has increased and has continued the erosion, even though it has reduced to some extent since then. But it has, since then, the erosion has become a major problem. Then there were a series of floods, not just in Assam, but in other parts of India as well. So national policy of flood was uh, proposed in 1954, and then their subsequent policies we'll see, which led to uh, the promotion of embankments as well, flood mitigation measures became very prominent since then. And Brahmaputra board was kind of designed or developed based on the concept of like Tennessee Valley Authority, function in a similar way, but it didn't end up the way they intended to, and it remains their interventions have largely been very limited and not very effective. And then after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2005, the government came up with the Disaster Management Act, which has since created disaster management authorities dedicated funding for disaster management activities. So I'm calling that critical junctures because all these events have caused some kind of change which has continued to affect the conditions, the context we see now. So changing land relations we see, as I mentioned earlier, when the Ahoms arrived, they promoted the settled agriculture in the region. Then it was mostly a feudal society with private homestead and sustenance farming. It was never about like uh, excessive production of food. It was mostly limited to the subsistence level and some additional amount which was then given to the king in a form of tax. Agriculture, land and forests were treated as commons. Everyone had access to them and they harvested whatever they needed. So we can say that it was kind of a moral economy which was based on mutual support, social norms, mutual obligation, responsibility. So people would help each other in terms of need. Even when there were floods, the king would adjust the amount of tax which was collected from the peasants. When the British arrived, they kind of started the process of state simplification, created the enclosure by like establishing the land tenure system, like creating private property so that they can collect revenue taxes from the farmers, as well as like alienating from the forest. Indiscriminate, as I mentioned, indiscriminate allocation of land for tea plantations. They kept on raising agricultural land tax because they wanted the locals to work in the tea plantations instead of their own agricultural land. So shifting agriculture significantly declined at that time, but it still existed. It was practiced by some of the communities, especially in the floodplains. This is a map which highlights like how a lot of tea estates were created and then a lot of additional land was so some parts of it was like granted, whereas a lot of areas were left for future plantation. So the planters acquired a lot of land and they kept it, but this area is largely eroded at this point, especially after the 1950s. So the river bank has kind of shifted outward and it's close to this area. This forest reserve has become an island now. Yeah, as I mentioned, like population was at the lowest, about 720,000 towards the end of 18th century. And so Britishers had to bring in a lot of laborers from Bihar and Orissa because locals used to work in tea plantations. And then to immigration and improvement in health conditions, the population increased about 8 million by 1930 by study. So immigrants, lot of these immigrants which came in into the state, they eventually settled in these floodplains, peripheries of the plantations, and some designated forest villages were created because they were employed by the forest department to work for them. So that way, one can say that the creation of vulnerability was to have permanent settlements in the floodplain in the first place. And then, so as I mentioned, like natives, initial, they used to not permanently settle in the floodplains, so they would move around as they practice shifting cultivation. So they never had permanent settlement, and they and use of embankments and levee. Here it is called levees and canals were used for irrigation purposes to retain as much as they need for the purpose of agriculture. And then rest of it was released. So it was not to prevent the crops from getting flooded, but to in fact use the flood water for as an advantage. So as some of the colonial writers have written about it, like the natives considered flooding as a blessing, and as it was a time for leisure because they would stop all their other work, rest for that flooded period, and then start working again once the flood water receded. But the British, because they established tea plantations, they explored, they found oil, crude oil, and they have set up commercial towns near the rivers. They had started promoting embankments as a measure to protect these assets they have created. Then, as I noticed, like through archival researches, the colonial documents tend to present flood as undesirable, which was not the case prior to that. And eventually all these interventions led to what used to be a flood dependent agrarian regime turned into a flood vulnerable landscape. So currently, some of the challenges with disaster response itself, what we see is like immediately after the flooding is there are limited number of flood shelters for people's safety. So people tend to evacuate either to some of the embankments if they are not eroded, or to some of the designated relief camps, which are mostly schools which are converted as a temporary shelter for them. So in those places, the basic services like drinking water, sanitation are very poor. And then I also some of the farmers which that I interviewed, they mentioned is even though they do receive relief, like when they're in relief camps, but when it comes to like restoring the agriculture, the aid delivery tends to be delayed. Like for example, they lost their crop, so agriculture department tends to provide some support, but they all due to bureaucratic processes. By the time they receive the support from the agriculture department, the planting time has already passed. So it's not like, for example, if the government is providing potato, they're not able to. The season has already ended for potato. So these are some of the bureaucratic issues, like that person mentioned. And we can see the number of people in relief camps are also declining over time, as people prefer to stay at their home or as close to their home as possible because of the poor conditions in relief camps. Then in terms of disaster mitigation, the national policy from 1954, I feel like in my opinion, it has been misinterpreted because like the policy clearly says that embankment is supposed to be a short-term measure and long-term measures have to be identified by the states, which was not the case. So in Ostrom workshop, I learned about the rules in use, the concept of rules in use, which clearly seen like what is being the difference between written rules and what is actually being practiced tends to be very different in some cases. At the same time, we can see the high modernity attitude of the government in terms of undue reliance on infrastructure like embankments and construction of roads in an unscientific manner, because roads are being constructed and embankments are being constructed without providing sufficient drainage outlets for flood water to drain out. So even though they are protecting some places from flooding, but they are causing water logging in other areas which are inside the cover protected by embankments. So because the flood water enters from other locations and then is blocked by embankments and roads which are not able to drain. And the so-called multi-purpose dams do not have the provision for a reservoir for flood control. So this has like recently one of the dam which is already completed has announced like whenever there's heavy rainfall upstream, they have to release the water because they don't have the provision. So in one of the northern district in northern bank tends to get affected every year because the dam has to release all the flood water because they don't have any provision for that. And now on top of that, like another dam is coming up in a similar location. And in addition to that, the China has also announced to build the world's biggest dam, which will be in place in a few years. And there's a lot of corruption also has been reported by media, as well as scholars have also written about it, the nexus between politicians, bureaucrats, and contractors who continue investing on embankments, which tend to, because embankments get breached, damaged, and have to be repaired every year. So there's a economy which has built around the construction and management of embankments. Absence of long-term solutions, despite some of the successes, engineering successes like Parsons and bags to protect erosion, but then it allowed some time for the state to come up with long-term solutions, but those long-term solutions were never properly planned and then executed. Absence of floodplain zoning is another issue. Like in 1975 itself, the National Flood Commission recommended the states to come up with policies, but none of the states have come up with such policies till date, citing resettlement as a major challenge. And then government has been trying on and off by dredging the river, which seems very futile because experts have mentioned like the Brahmaputra River carries about 2 million tons of sediments every day, and dredging them, it's not possible. There's not enough equipment to even dredge the river. And then absence of risk-informed development planning, which can be seen in with what I notice is even though the planning is supposed to be participatory starting at the grassroots level, there's hardly any awareness about how long-term planning has to be done to ensure that roads which are being constructed or any other infrastructure which is being proposed by the community are not creating additional problems for them. And one of the major challenges, even though disaster management authorities exist at every level, they cannot interfere with the development activities which are carried out by other departments. As I mentioned, like this was in Dibrugarh. This is one area where I visited. This was one of the spur which was constructed and helped in. This was one of the spurs which were constructed to prevent further erosion of the Dibrugarh town, which has increased significantly. So but this was eroded in the month of July while I was doing my field work. And since then, so basically when I interviewed one of the retired engineers, he mentioned is like, while these spurs were effective, it needs to be constantly monitored whether how long it will sustain. And then maybe in some cases, new spurs have to be built because they, after a point, they may not be effective as initially they are. And at the same time, other development activities like uh, unregulated sand mining, which has also been reported, has which is close to the river bank, have also increased further river bank erosion in the last few years. There are some opportunities as well. Let's not all doom and gloom. Strengthening the water Brahmaputra board would be important. There has been talks going on for a few years to strengthen it because they are at the moment understaffed and have not carried out the master plans that they have prepared, which is their mandate. But at the same time, there's a lot of secrecy around these master plans. What was studied, what actually they have proposed is not known to the public. I'm trying to find informants who are aware of those plans and what those plans actually contain is something I'm trying to explore. Scientific study which has been proposed by even international experts from Mississippi River Commission and US Army Corps of Engineers who visited sometime between 1960s to 1980s to advise the Indian government. That scientific study is yet to be conducted at the river basin level. It was also pointed out to me by one of the geologists as well as one of the respondents who's a retired engineer from Water Resources Department. So there is a component in a recently announced ADB finance project about they will conduct a basin level study, but the details are not available at the moment, how exactly and what all they will study. There's another World Bank finance project which has proposed for dedicated flood shelters in different districts across the state. So that is in progress. And then there are a lot of voices, but they are always minority, even within the government, who are not pro embankment, who are proposing other solutions. But those voices are very limited. And also the space for academia is very limited at the moment. So creating space for those minority voices is required. And I noticed like what the local community is experiencing hardly comes up with neither in the news media reports as well as like government studies, like what people are actually experiencing. As one of the respondent informed me, who's involved with the World Bank project, is there are a lot of issues which are emerging at the localized level. It's not like a blanket approach can be taken for even an entire district. So more localized interventions have to be done at the village level or village council level. So those experiences have to be documented, and some of those experiences expressed by the respondents during my fieldwork was like, this is a community which formerly used to work in tea gardens. Basically, they are descendants of the immigrants who came from other states, and their traditional houses are like built on like low plains. This is an area which is frequently waterlogged because of the embankment which I was standing on. So you mentioned like erosion is a major problem. So for them, embankment provides some sort of protection, but they can deal with flood. So even though that's not a very good condition, but for them, erosion is a major problem. Similarly, another location which is like slightly further interior away from the river is where people still want floods because they are dependent on agriculture, and flood water that comes through the tributaries of Brahmaputra is very much necessary for them for the irrigation purposes. Then in Jorhat district, I noticed like people mentioned, this is not a erosion prone area, but a flood prone, and they don't have amendments. So they mentioned like the trees and the vegetation which exist. And this year, last year, the flood water, the vegetation prevent or sand to be deposited on their paddy fields. But instead created a new area, like extended kind of the river bank temporarily. So it may get eroded over time, but the vegetation kind of help, which I also came across in an archival document that it was discussed to have vegetation around the river banks, but there was no follow-up document what actually was done since then. Then this is a success story according to the Water Resource Department as part of the ADB funded project is the revetments, like they use sandbags and have stabilized the river bank. And as I mentioned, like one of the respondents mentioned that not every area is facing erosion. So not all areas require amendment. So every location have to be studied properly and appropriate measures have to be implemented. And apart from that, there are some other issues which I came across during my field work is like, even though flooding apparently flooding is not a major issue for most of the farmers. For them, as long as the flood water recedes on time, they can sow their paddy saplings again and have some kind of harvest every year. But because of deforestation, which is going around, the shrinking of habitat for elephants, there are a lot of elephant population in the state. So they tend to come out of the forest in search of food. They eat up paddy and whatever food they can get easy access to in the open areas. And then the agriculture department official told me like, because tea plantation is struggling a lot, so now they're trying to expand it as much as possible. And small tea growers are also increasing in numbers. So the tea plantation area is increasing, which is becoming a threat to agriculture itself because food, it's mostly a cash crop, so food production is decreasing in the state. And then agriculture department is providing high yielding varieties of paddy, but at the same time, these are not local varieties, and slowly people are forgetting, are not able to access the local paddy varieties which used to exist. They are no longer able to access them because no one is producing them. So slowly, they mentioned that slowly these paddy local indigenous varieties of paddy are disappearing. Yeah, so and I would like to thank the Bias Center and my department, Geography department, as well as Ostrom workshop for all the funding to carry out my research so far. And I would like to thank my advisor, Mike, and my other committee members for their continuous support and advice.
Move up here and handle the online forum. They're a rowdy bunch, so somebody's got to manage them. But starting from the group, any questions to kick us off?
Start with students.
Yeah, I mean, are there any students that have a question? They're all shaking their heads. Fisher?
I'm not a student. I'm an old guy. So you're basically telling a long story from 1200 all the way to the present. And there's more bad times than good times for all kinds of reasons. So you're looking for that, say, that good time to then try to say what governance would promote the good time? I'm trying to figure out what you're aiming for.
At the moment, I'm trying to find like, hopefully I want to focus more on these possible opportunities that exist at the moment where the governance can be improved. But not forgetting what the historical processes have been, because I did not come across all these like, for example, permanent settlement in the floodplains is a major issue which neither the government, no one else is talking about. Either people are uh, criticizing the embankments or failure of the government in reducing or preventing erosion or flooding from happening. Whereas they're not looking at how people have adapted in the past to the flood regime. So there are local communities like there's a community called Missing, and they
Sorry, I minimized it here. Let me pull it back up and. I'll minimize it.
the slide.
Mouse. Lift the
Just
mouse.
click on a slide, any slide,
Um,
yeah. So these are missing communities who have their houses built on raised plains. And one of the major issues they are now facing is because of the land tenure system, because they used to practice shifting cultivation, and they're not able to, they're stuck with one plot of land. Whereas earlier they used to move around according to the availability of fertile land as well as flooding. So they would disassemble their house and move to a new location. So those practices are slowly disappearing. But still, these are the kind of communities who can survive, who have adapted to this, to live in the floodplains. Whereas some other communities, like immigrant communities, who used to work in tea gardens, are not really adapted to that kind of regime. So, and they are also willing to resettle in other areas because they are largely engaged in the service sector. So they are into daily wage labor or other work and not so much on agriculture. So so that kind of a scientific study is needed to understand what kind of different demographic groups exist and what are their needs, how they can, everyone doesn't need to be resettled. That's the point. Yes.
no,
I have a comment, and I apologize if this is repetitive for you, but I'm super happy to be able to see your presentation, to see a little bit more of your work. So thank you for that presentation. I think that maybe your question is not why flood mitigation efforts by the government had failed, but how they are simply not the solution at all. Like they cannot work. There's no way in which they can work. And you show us that from a perspective that combines environmental history with critical agrarian studies, with political ecology, thinking with all of those about how really this is, what you're showing us is the afterlives of colonialism and the plantation economy. And in a sense, there's no hope for that. Like all development projects are failed projects. There's not a single development project that has succeeded in its own terms. That's, what classic work from Gupta, Ferguson, Mitchell says, that actually that's what development does. So what I was thinking is that two things. One, I would be super suspicious about ideas that replicate the idea of a state failure. So narratives that replicate, the old trope of deficiency. So when you point, for example, to corruption, population increase, lack of planning, lack of long-term solutions, absence of information, those are the problems that are only seen by one side. So those are very colonial diagnoses of something that you have shown us that is really more complicated. You have told us about indentured labor and forced labor and, the complete erosion of moral economies, of subsistence agriculture, and the violence that it takes to do that in a specific space. So blaming it on the victims seems kind of, like the colonial answer to like replicating the colonial diagnosis of the problem, like the version that they have. And I think that maybe it would be super useful, and this is where I think I can be super repetitive because probably you'll know already this, but I think that, thinking with ideas of uneven development. I've been reading Daniel Purifoy's work, for example, is super interesting. I don't know if you've read Clyde Wood's, that book, Development Drowned. Maybe yes, sorry, Mike, if I'm just repeating. It's called Development Drowned and Reborn. It is a new edition of his work, a posthumous edition by Laura Pulido and Jordan Camp, that is amazing and has to do with this. Or Alejandro Camargo's work on disaster governance, disaster management, because this is a very similar story to Colombia, to specific areas of Colombia that Alejandro is doing research on and the hydropolitics of it. So I guess that, my big comment is that what you present us already has the answer of why those efforts coming from above will never work, because they're part of the problem. That's what created the problem in the first place. So then the question is, what are, the processes that are behind that? And I think that if you look at colonialism, plantations, this idea of how you underdevelop one place to develop other one, I think that would be maybe, an interesting way to put together all of this amazing work, because you have all of the, the environmental history, you have all of the elements already there. So it was more, like a recommendation for readings. Yeah. Alejandro Camargo and Clyde Woods are. Daniel Purifoy as well. Maybe those three.
Alejandro what, sorry?
Camargo. He's coming on the week after the AG, so that is March 31st. He's gonna give a lecture here at the Ostrom workshop on hydropolitics, so keep an eye on his work.
Is that the one you emailed me about?
Yes, Karen, thank you. Karen will make it happen. It takes really a village for, for all the things
We're
that
gonna fly him in here. So.
Karen, do you have a question? I'm sorry, did you want to respond?
No,
We were talking.
I don't have a question.
Yeah, well, I thought your hand was up. I know Mike's.
I was itching my head.
Okay, so, and I think we got McGinnis online. You want to jump in here?
Yeah, thanks. Let me see if I can get my video started here. Yeah, okay.
You can stop
We
sharing.
can see Mike.
Hang on.
We can see you. Wait.
Okay.
There you go.
Wow. Hey.
Hi. This has been a very good presentation about sort of a problem that's been developing for years. I just read a book about the Mississippi River management in this country, and most of those same problems are kind of in here too. So it's sort of very reminiscent of those kinds of problems. And I sympathize with your interest in trying to get local solutions or local governments to come up with better strategies, better planning to sort of react to these problems. But I gotta say, Bernie kind of ruined your whole presentation for me by asking about this humongous dam that's going to be built on the river in the Chinese part of this upriver from this. And so you're worried about them adjusting to the problem they face now. But the problem's going to change in fundamental ways in 2 years, 2 or 3 years, or whatever it takes to build the damn thing. because they're no longer going to be facing the same distribution of water coming down to the river. It's going to be very much affected by what the Chinese are doing with the water they have. I know they're going to be building a lot of electricity from it. I presume they're going to be taking some of the water and using it elsewhere in China, and so I would presume the flow of water is going to be lower coming in. It's going to be, it's no longer going to be a purely natural variation in terms of how much the water is coming down. And there's going to have to be some sort of, I don't know, coordination, or at least hope that the Chinese will give them some information about what they're going to be doing with this. I mean, you've got this very powerful country right north of it that's going to be changing the entire physical conditions that these communities are facing. So how does that fit into this? And and I know India and Chinese governments don't exactly get along well with each other. And there's no reason really to expect that to change much here. But, how does that complicate this and make this no longer a historical problem from colonialism and no longer a local problem, but now a problem in sort of these power relations between these two regional adversaries and this stuff? And what do the local people do about that? Can they, is that just another problem they have no control over? So just, again, thanks to Bernie for having me think about this all the way through here, because I really think it's critical in changing the nature of the kind of problem they're going to be facing. So I'd like to hear your reaction to that.
I think locals don't have a lot of say in terms of whether China will build the dam or not and how
No,
it will
no.
be managed. But apart from Brahmaputra, there are many other other rivers that flows from the Tibetan side as well as from the southern side of the state. So it's not just Brahmaputra. So there are other rivers which also tend to, which are basically tributaries of Brahmaputra. They also bring in a lot of flood water, which then enters into Brahmaputra. So there are a lot of other rivers which will continue to have enough water and will continue to cause flooding. And at the same time, this region also is known for heavy rainfall. What climate change is doing is the cloud bursts which are now happening are very localized. So which is causing flash floods in a smaller area at a very short period of time. These are the new emerging trends which people are noticing and are reporting about it. Government knows about it. They have not done much. So more than the dam, I would say the localized cloud bursts and the which are increasing and becoming more unpredictable due to climate change will be a problem, as well as there'll be other rivers which will continue to have water and can cause flooding in the future.
Okay, that was a good clarification. I was just presuming that the Tibetan source of it would be the primary source. I'm getting it confused with sort of the way
that's the major river, but there are a lot of other tributaries as well.
Yeah, and I was thinking I'm glad you brought up the global climate change, because I was thinking that that's also part of what they've got to deal with, but that they also have this geopolitical problem that's a little different from the geopolitical stuff. And are there going to be dams in any other of those tributaries? Any in the other sort of neighboring countries? I don't know. You go through Burma, I presume, so I don't know what's happening in there. But that's an interesting point that you make, that this is very similar to the problems of dealing with the geopolitical. I mean the cultural changes. The environmental changes from global climate change. But then they've also got this. I mean, it's going to be a geopolitical sort of issue too. So just one more bit of complication there.
Yeah.
Good luck.
And one can also say that the government is kind of also hypocritical. On one hand, they are criticizing China for the dam. At the same time, they are trying to build other dams on rivers within their territory. So the northern state of Arunachal Pradesh has a lot of rivers where already 2 dams have been built and government is trying to build more dams. Although locals are resisting, there are a lot of pending cases which are in the court, as well as National Green Tribunal has also intervened where people are going to be displaced because of the dams and have raised concerns. So those issues are also kind of linked with overall flood situation in the northeastern region.
Okay, we got 2 questions in the back of the room. Start there in the corner.
Hi, I'm interested in that when you mentioned about climate change and on top of Diana's suggestion, I think McCarthy, he has a good article saying about like the mitigation is adaptation mitigation is actually is like a contested process. And some groups, some can be like seen is adaptation, but harmful for the other groups. And I'm thinking about like on the embankments and on technology or technical fix. Actually, because it is very similar to the coastal area, particularly in the Mekong Delta, where they have a lot of and they work in this area and they have to be like harmful and they allow flood in other area, like group of population make live while other people, or let's say a group of subgroup of population have to die in order to make live for the other people. So I think it's just a recommendation of that one and think about it.
Yeah, definitely. I think late 90s, early 2000s, government, UN agencies tried to promote these so-called community-based projects, which completely failed because they ignored the fact that communities are not able to create laws, like make laws or change policies. They can to some extent, but not all is in their control. So their living conditions cannot be dramatically changed, and put all the responsibility on the community themselves to fend for themselves did not work. So now we don't hear about these community-based projects anymore. These are mostly either top down or only in development projects is where some level of community consultation happens. So that's why I suggest that like the community lived experience of the local communities have to be taken into account in terms of developing plans from the grassroots level to the federal level.
Last question.
I have a bit of a comment and a question. So my comment is on dam formation and the impacts that we've kind of decided would be, sounded like almost like a panacea to flooding, when the reality is you're not addressing the sort of the heart of what you're talking about is these competitive development initiatives that people at different scales are experiencing. And so even if it were the case in which dams halted flooding, you also have those people who are relying on the flooding for the sediment deposits. And so that's not addressing that competitive need. And so I guess my question then ties into, have you looked at other river basins that manage this more effectively? And so like, I know that the UNECE, the Water Convention team, they have a lot of mediating mechanisms in place that help incorporate multiple scales of competing demands on the same resources to see if they can come to more equitable solutions. And so I would be interested to hear if you know of other similar basins that manage it more effectively and how perhaps top-down governance could incorporate these other mechanisms.
I've read about the Danube River basin, because I'm not focusing on the dam issues because that requires a whole set of.
That was just an
Yeah.
aside to explain why
Yeah,
that's
but
in a
yeah,
solution.
Danube River in Europe is one example where different countries have come together and kind of sorted out the problems of water sharing, because different dams have been built across time. So and US also, I think there are good examples in terms of the Mississippi River where different states have come into place and have tried to solve some of the water sharing problems, as well as like in Netherlands, as well as in US also, like removing levies in some cases where they are no longer effective or required, and creating room for the river to move and spread and reducing the flood risk in the process.
Well, I thank everybody for the time. I know you do have one more prosecutor in the back. But we're wrapping up now, but Gustavo's got some thoughts for you, so you might want to connect with him. But thank you very much.
It's cool. It's like
For the resource series, yes, for the colloquium, we are